Tēnā koutou katoa, ka nui te mihi kia koutou. Tēnā koe rauinia, and thank you for that. I'm not going to embellish my description. I'm Ngāti Awa and Ngāti Prau. That's all you need to know. Plus I'm a mother and a grandmother, and everything else is incidental. I want to acknowledge the main sponsors of this, the Human Rights Commission and Massey University's Global Centre for Indigenous Leadership, to be able to have a 2-day conference that has no registration fees is truly amazing. And I really thank the Commission and all its sponsors for their commitment to provide this public space. But I also want to say that the Human Rights Commission has actually been a part of the journey of the Declaration since the very beginning. They've had representatives throughout all the negotiations, and they've remained the champion of the Declaration, the one place that continues to keep it in the public eye, and they really should be congratulated for that. And I'd like to acknowledge the organising committee and my fellow panellists, which is now a panellist of one. But Rawiri, you're one of the very few Māori academics who proactively provides commentary in the public arena on issues, and I think it's a role that used to be very common with Rangi Walker and my father, Hirini, but very few do it now. So I really want to thank you. I always enjoy when you have written something. It's like an exciting piece that I need to look through, and I appreciate your analysis. Okay, so what am I doing?
So that'll go to the next slide.
Okay. So I'm going to start here with the Mātātua Declaration for 2 reasons. One is that it's because of Ngāti Awa and the Raupatu claim and the return of the wharenui Mātātua that is the reason that I first travelled to Geneva. At the time, in 1988, it was to table the Raupatu claim because Ngāti Awa had no confidence in the national process, but it was also to talk about the struggles that iwi were having in trying to repatriate the Mātātua wharenui. And from that journey to Geneva, it became a lifetime career. It's how I got involved in cultural and intellectual property rights. Today we're commemorating 10 years of the Declaration's adoption, but next June is going to be the 25th anniversary of the Mātātua Declaration on the cultural and intellectual property rights of Indigenous peoples. And I want you to save the date, June 17th to 19th, because we're having a national conference on Māori cultural intellectual property rights in Nelson next year, to be hosted by Ngāti Koata as one of the claimants of the Y262 claim, with the support of Ngāti Awa. What I always think about with this declaration is that, to me, the journey was and remains more important than the destination. And what I mean by that is that the destination is important. It was about getting an international declaration on the rights of Indigenous peoples, getting that passed through the UN General Assembly and having governments implement it so that we could end colonisation and live as distinct peoples without discrimination. And despite all the fears that some governments had, and you heard some of those today, the S in peoples and recognition of the right of self-determination, despite all those fears that governments had, the day the Declaration was adopted, and every day since then, guess what? The sky did not fall down. Society as we know it did not descend into chaos. The global economy did not collapse, and there wasn't a rush of new applications to the UN Decolonisation Committee. In fact, the day after the Declaration, if you do a Google search of the top news item, the main news item is that Pope Benedict XVI had blasted Europeans for being selfish and not having enough children at a sermon in Austria. So that's the impact that it had. And we have had to endure a lot of nonsense from states, deliberate delaying tactics, excuses for not being able to agree to text. And sometimes they had the audacity to say that their objections were based on wanting the best for us. And we're still having to contend with that kind of nonsense in the declaration, in the implementation of the declaration. And that's why the journey around the destination is always going to be problematic. It's always going to be stressful and difficult. But the journey about the participation was life-changing. It was historical, it was empowering, because we met each other. So as Indigenous delegates, and that's why I picked the soul, you'd go over there yourself, representing your community, representing your iwi, for the issues that you have. You felt alone. And you walked into this UN, and there in front of you was this whole network of people. People that in some cases we were told were extinct. People we were told by their governments had chosen to assimilate and didn't want to be Indigenous. We met each other and we found out the issues that each community faces, and those issues got transformed into the text that you see in the UN Declaration. So we can never unsee each other. We can never unhear each other. And from this experience, what has happened with the world's Indigenous peoples is truly amazing. It's a global movement, and it's very strong, and we are connected, and social media has made it even better. So if somebody is murdered in Bolivia, we find out about it within hours, and we can mobilize and we support each other. That is, to me, the very best part of the journey of the Declaration. And the struggle that we're going to continue to have to get states to implement it is something that we have to do. But the best part of it is continuing to be ourselves, to support ourselves, to grow, to develop, and to continue to engage as Indigenous peoples globally. I didn't know what picture to put, so I put up the beautiful treaty. But when I make the claim we're part of the text, I don't say that this is a definitive list. It's actually my memory, which is not always the best. But in terms of those who went across, I could name the individuals, but I decided to name the organisations that they represented. And these are just the years that I personally was involved. We had a good selection of people. For Ngāti Te they went over because of the Maiora tar sands. I went, as I said, for Ngāti Awa, for the Mātātua Wharenui. We had people going over because at that time it was a broadcasting claim. So we can look at the text of the Declaration and say to ourselves, oh, I helped that. That's my word, or we were part of that. Even with all the changes that were made by governments, we're there, it's ours. So the main reason for sticking with this declaration is because it's ours. And what states do with it, as I say, we can only take some responsibility for, but the major is us. We have to do this for us. We have to do this for all those who travelled to Geneva, many of whom lost their lives. They were murdered on return. And we used to start our sessions every year with a minute's silence to acknowledge those who had died. People gave their lives for this declaration. That's what it is, not just a series of words. One of the things, however, that's quite amazing about this declaration, so it has 24 preambular paragraphs and 46 operative articles. And everyone always goes straight for the articles, but I'm a preambular person because the preamble is the whakapapa. It lays down the understandings that underpin why you're then about to declare something. And that's where all the guts of the issues are. And you will find words in the preamble that you won't find in the operative paragraphs. But something about the declaration that I guess it's this way because the only way to get it through the political system, but it doesn't mention racism. And while the purpose of the declaration is about the shared experience of colonisation and the wish to end colonisation, you only find reference to colonisation in one preambular paragraph. So the very values that underpin the reason for having the declaration that then explains why you set out these rights, the wording isn't continually thread through. So we have a responsibility, therefore, to make sure that those underpinnings are kept at the forefront. I guess one of the issues that I have here in New Zealand is that we continually skirt around issues around Māori, and you can't deal with the many problems that face Māori without dealing with the root causes. You can throw as much money at it as you want. You can rename it, you can recast it, you can put frameworks around it. But if you don't acknowledge why there are so many Māori in prison, why we have so many problems with domestic abuse, and many other issues, if you can't name the problem, you can't solve the problem. And the problem is that colonisation is still here. It hasn't gone. We haven't ended it yet. And it is manifested on a daily basis through racism. And I don't mean just societal racism, but institutional, systemic racism that is so embedded in the culture of organisations that if you even try to suggest that an organisation is racist, they would be genuinely shocked. They would be genuinely shocked. And that's what makes it the toughest kind of racism to deal with, because you won't get people who accept what's happening. So, I mean, what do I mean by institutional racism? Well, some of the things that I've encountered, even at a personal level, professional level. So I was subjected to a meeting, a faculty meeting, where the dean said to all the staff, well, do you want to continue having to pay their salary being the Māori staff, because our numbers weren't as high as everybody else's? And he somehow turned that into a personal attack on the Māori staff. At another meeting, the same person said that he thought that iwi should pay the salaries of the Māori academic staff because they've got all this money from treaty settlements. Now, if you were to tell this person he was racist, he wouldn't, it would be shocking, but of course he is. And that's what I mean by this race. It's just so, it permeates everything. And another one with the universities who have translated their name to be wānanga, and yet have taken to court and are trying to do everything possible to not allow wānanga to call themselves universities. Now, there's no logic in this argument. I mean, this is purely racism and the feeling that one system is better than another. So I do applaud again. Gee, I'm saying a lot of nice things about the Human Rights Commission, but they've launched this campaign about racism, and it needs to be supported, and more people need to be just calling it for what it is, calling the issue for what it is. But what I'd also like to say, so some of the previous speakers talked about the Committee on the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, or CERD, and the fact that the committee has just released on August 29th their report, their observations about New Zealand. So in the context of looking at race discrimination, it's very interesting to see that New Zealand features heavily every time the committee reports. And in this latest report of the recommendations, they're pretty fundamental. The New Zealand government has been asked about why they haven't implemented the Y262 recommendations, and they've asked for a plan of action. They've asked why the New Zealand government hasn't implemented the Constitutional Advisory Panel's recommendations, and they've asked them for a plan of action. They've queried New Zealand's approach to land, to fresh water, and asked for an elaboration of whether they really think that the treaty settlement process and the way they describe it is consistent with the principle of free, prior and informed consent. And it's very few organisations actually get involved in the third committee and the reports that New Zealand offers. I mean, you have the opportunity to put in an alternate report, and it would be really useful to see more people do that and provide a different voice. When Cheryl was speaking, she talked about how ministers in Canada are referring to the declaration, and they're making statements about principles like free, prior, informed consent. And although there's a kind of bitterness in how they're doing it and that it's qualified, they're at least talking about it. Our ministers zip nothing. They don't talk about the declaration. And as we saw, there's even a directive to specifically exclude mention of the declaration in any treaty settlements. So as with poverty, you can't address an issue if you don't name it, if you don't actually identify what it is. So we have to mobilise to ensure that the declaration is in the vocabulary of all the ministers. Here today, after this session, there's a political session, and it'll be really interesting to see what the MPs have to say about the declaration. Please question them rigorously. Within the declaration, Article 38 says that states in consultation and cooperation with Indigenous peoples shall take the appropriate measures, including legislative measures, to achieve the ends of this declaration. And it's one of the clearest, most succinct statements in the declaration, that whatever is done has to be done with Indigenous peoples. Now, if Te Ururo was here, I was really hoping he was here, because I was now going to turn directly to talk to him. But just to say that there are many things that government could do that it's not doing to get some traction. To begin with, they can reject Finlayson's stance on the declaration and get rid of that and make sure that in the future any treaty settlements do mention the declaration. They could also require within government that any new policies, laws or practices should have a little tick box in them to say whether these contribute to the implementation of the declaration. This would not only make officials analyse the implications of any policy, laws or practice, but it would also be useful for when government has to report on its implementation. Te Puni Kōkiri, as the lead agency in government for Māori policy, should champion the declaration. It's wonderful that the Human Rights Commission does it, but TPK should be doing it. And when TPK officials roll into a room, instead of people's eyes rolling over because it's TPK, they should be rolling over because they know that TPK is going to say, what about the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples? Officials should get trained to do it before TPK goes in that room and says something. So these are not massive changes that I'm actually asking. These are quite simple, and yet I really know that they're not. And the other thing is, we've heard in the opening speeches about government freezing the appointment of an Indigenous Rights Commissioner. Well, clearly that needs to be unfrozen. So those are just some very quick little suggestions, helpful suggestions I had for the Minister. So within the Iwi Chairs Forum, you've heard a few speakers also refer to the Iwi Collective Monitoring Mechanism, and that's a very open process. Essentially, all iwi were invited to nominate representatives for this group, and the role of the group is to develop a framework for how we can measure government's implementation of the declaration article by article. And we have actually done that. We've developed a template, but we're not very good at populating it, because no one can agree on whether government gets a 1 or a 2 or a 0. But the thing is, we started, we've done something. And we did have a meeting with officials, and we showed it to them, and they were very impressed, but we've never heard from them again. But the thing is that we have to show our commitment, and we're doing it on our part. But government needs to step up and do it as well. My last slide is this one, which came across my Facebook feed, and I contacted Paola to say for permission to use it. She used this as her waka when she was travelling around Aotearoa gathering stories about child abuse and state care as part of her PhD thesis. She wanted to be here but couldn't, so she was thrilled that at least her waka gets to be here in this photo. But it's so simple, isn't it? Nothing about us without us. It's actually, that is the declaration condensed into 4 words. Nothing about us, well, that's 5 words. Whoops. But the principle of we should always be at the table, we should be talking, we should be discussing. This is a shared journey. This is something that we have in common. And why the fear of talking to Māori, I don't know. But we're not going to make any great changes until we do. While I call it a shared journey, I would say that there are things that Māori have to do by ourselves and amongst ourselves and for ourselves, and likewise with other Indigenous peoples. There are things that the Crown has to do to sort itself out, to stop feeling so risk-averse about liking Māori and doing good things for Māori. And there are some things that we will have to do together. And as long as those who participate in each of these journeys understands that we need all 3 and respects those who work in the other journeys, that we should get there at the end. Kia ora tātou.